I'm Andy Hatch. I'm the president of the Great Salt Lake chapter of the NCMA. This event is presented by our chapter of the NCMA in conjunction with Weber State University. We'd also like to recognize and thank our sponsors, Weber State University MBA program, Centtiva, LSI, the VA Acquisition Academy, PTAC, Utah's Procurement Technical Assistance Center, Woodbury Technology, Booz Allen Hamilton, and Keomac. I would personally like to thank the folks from Centtiva, John Esplin, Robert Lindsay, and Annie Kwan. They were the driving force behind getting this all put together and making this happen today. So it wasn't very long ago that this was just an idea, and so we were able to put this together, and it looks great, I think. So the ICMS is envisioned to be an event that will reach out to the contracting community in the Intermountain region and allow us to share ideas and gain perspectives in the current trends and best practices in our career field. We've reached out to senior leaders in the field and are excited about the roster of speakers that we have. The theme of today's seminar is public-private partnerships, or working together between government and industry. We welcome participants from government contracting organizations and industry. We look forward to a day of collaboration and dialogue that will open our eyes and our minds to ideas that will improve the procurement process. Our vision is that this will be an annual event.
In 1992, 30 years after his involvement in Wallace Bennett's successful re-election campaign, he followed in his father's footsteps with a successful campaign for himself, which took him to the U.S. Senate for 18 years. While there, Bob was highly regarded as a pragmatic problem solver and established himself as a powerful consensus builder among his constituents and colleagues. He served on numerous Senate committees and chaired the distinguished Joint Economic Committee, where he was at the center of the national economic policy discussions. He also served as the ranking Republican on the Senate Rules Committee and as counsel to Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. Bob is a highly successful entrepreneur. Prior to his Senate career, he served as the CEO of Franklin Quest, which he joined when the firm only had 4 full-time employees. The business grew to more than 1,000 prior to its listing on the New York Stock Exchange. For his work at Franklin, he was named Executive of the Year for the Rocky Mountain region by Inc. magazine. Bob is currently chairman of the Bennett Group with offices in Washington, D.C. and Salt Lake City. He is also a senior policy advisor at Arent Fox, who works with a wide range of international clients, and serves as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. A member of the Board of Trustees of the German Marshall Fund, honorary U.S. President of the Transatlantic Policy Network, and as resident scholar at the University of Utah's Hinckley Institute of Politics, where he lectures part-time. His newspaper column on politics appears weekly in the Deseret News. Bob is married to former Joyce McKay, and they are parents of 6 children. Please join me in welcoming Bob Bennett today.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Let me find out to whom I am speaking. How many of you are federal employees? Okay. How many of you are not federal employees? All right, you can sleep through this. No, you'll be interested, I think. I'll do this with the understanding that most of you here are federal employees and talk about the challenges that we have in creating public-private partnerships between private contractors and the federal government. One of the things that I discovered after I left the Senate and people started coming around to Bennett Group, almost inevitably the first thing they wanted to know was, how do we deal with the federal government? And my first reaction, which I was careful not to blurt out, was, beats me. But I've discovered that the gap between private contractors who want to deal with the federal government and have something very worthwhile to offer the federal government and the federal procurement process whereby that might be facilitated, that gap is very large and needs to be closed. And it's not your fault, speaking to the federal employees, but you can do something to help close that gap if you are aware of how difficult it is for anybody to approach the federal government and try to get something done. Let me give you an anecdote from my nephew, who is in the IT business, tied up with a group that has developed a procedure of how you manage your IT programs that is extremely successful. And he gives seminars all over the country. He had a sense of some satisfaction when he was asked to come lecture the IT people at Harvard. He was a graduate of MIT, and so it felt good to go to Harvard and tell them how to run their IT program. The company that developed this seminar positioned him in Washington, D.C. because they said, we want to break into the government market, and you are our best presenter, and we're going to devote you entirely to the government. And they did the necessary recruiting and got a bunch of government IT experts in a room, and he stood up, and his standard opening statement was, gives in every seminar, if you do exactly what I tell you to do, you can cut your IT costs 50%. But you have to do everything I tell you. Now, don't come to me and say, what is it that he tells you? Because I don't have the slightest idea. You know, when it comes to IT, I turn to my grandchildren who will then take over my iPhone and program it for me because, you know, that's an entirely different generation. But they make that claim and they have been able to produce, which is why they're so successful. He went through his standard presentation, and when he got through, the IT folks came up to him and said, we can't do anything you told us to do. He said, what do you mean you can't do anything? He said, we've got to get the budget process. We've got to go through budget authority that would change this. And we filed that 6 times before the budget, and OMB and all the rest of it, went through the whole thing and said it would take us 2 years to get approval to make those kinds of changes. We can't do it. We can't shift our resources in the way you have described to put emphasis here and change it there and so on. And again, I'm saying more than I really understand about what it was he was telling them what to do. But these people said, we understand exactly what you're saying, and it makes good sense, and we can't do it. And he came to me and he says, Uncle Bob, you're a senator, fix it. To which the immediate answer is, I can't do it either. But that is a demonstration of the gulf that exists and that needs to be worked on. The federal government needs to work on it, but the folks in the private sector also need to understand how things work in the federal government. One of the things we've discovered at Bennett Group, as I say, is people come to us and say, help us navigate these waters, and that's what we're now trying to develop the expertise to do at Bennett Group, because we realize there's an enormous market for it. It's not just the contracting, it's figuring out how to approach, whom to talk to, where to send, just the whole
lubricant
business of how
that greased the wheels that would grind so slowly in the normal kind of process. In that sort of process, I could have gotten the head of IT at a cabinet level department and say, why is it that you cannot adapt your IT practices to this? Alerted by the activity that my nephew had described, we could cut through some of this and facilitate a lot of the public-private partnerships. As soon as we stopped doing that,
auto workers.
and by coincidence, this
Normally
is
you
not a
don't
cause and effect
identify
circumstance,
a labor union with humor, but all right, the United Auto Workers, talking to a fellow, said, you know, if there is ever a nuclear event in Colorado, if ever anybody sets off a nuclear bomb, not Colorado, in Detroit, if anybody ever sets off a nuclear device in Detroit, you know where you want to be? And they said, no, where do you want to be? The safest place to be. He says, the safest place to be is on the 3rd floor of the General Motors building. And he said, why the 3rd floor? And he says, because the 4th floor is where the General Motors lawyers are, and nothing ever gets through the 4th floor. Substitute OMB for the lawyers, and you've got an understanding of one of the major problems in the federal government. Nothing ever gets through OMB. I'm one of the few people who has dealt with OMB as a member of the executive branch. I was in the Nixon administration, in the Department of Transportation, and in the legislative branch. And inevitably, you start to come to some kind of discussion about how things can be done more efficiently, and you bump into OMB. OMB says you have to do it this way. OMB says, that's basically what these folks were telling my nephew. We have these budgetary requirements and procedures that become so onerous that it's almost impossible to get anything done. Another quick anecdote as to the consequences of that. Yes, the newspaper will talk about the $400 toilet seat or the $1,200 hammer or whatever came out of some of the DOD stuff in the 1980s or 90s, and we've never lived that down, and it's still around. But I was chairman of the committee that dealt with the Y2K problem. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, John Hamley, was the DOD executive who testified before our committee and with whom we had regular interaction. And he said to me in the course of all of this, he said, you did us a huge favor because we had no real idea about DOD computers until you started pushing on us with respect to the potential Y2K problem. He said, we had never done an inventory of all of the computers in DOD until you started hammering on us. How are your computers going to do? Are the computers going to fail? Is Y2K going to? He said, we did a complete inventory of all of the computers at DOD, and we were stunned at what we found. If you were in DOD, now again, this is 2000, if you were in DOD and you had a 286 machine, you had a really hot item. He said we were so far behind the curve in what private industry would have because the process, the procurement process was so slow and so ponderous and so tied to so many rules that the agility to say we're getting rid of that and we're going this way simply wasn't there in the federal government. And this becomes a huge, huge challenge. Now, normally when I give a speech with circumstances like that, I have a solution. And I have good news. I don't have so much solution and good news on this one, but I can give you just a little bit of sunlight. And let me go now to the federal institution I probably know the best, which is the Congress. People are always polite. You find that they are far more excited about you and far more enthusiastic about what a wonderful senator you are after you are no longer the senator. You know, while you're the senator, they're not nearly as anxious to come up and tell you what a good job you're doing. But once there are no consequences for their saying nice things, they can come up and tell you what a good job you did. It doesn't make any difference at that point. But people come up and they say, you know, we're so sorry you're not there. Oh, you know, if you were there, you could talk to them. And I say to them and very truthfully, you know, I'm just as glad I'm not there anymore because the process has broken down so badly that maybe there is a competitor to OMB for the title of the place where nothing ever gets through. And it's the United States Senate. And the challenge is that, and I will not make this a political speech or any kind of partisan review, but the entire process of budgeting and appropriating has broken down and basically come to a screeching halt. And that was the part that, frankly, I enjoyed the most. I was an appropriator, and an appropriator that controls the money, you can get things done. And part of the whole question of dealing with the private partnership challenge with the private entities and the federal government was, if you can't break through any other way, you go see your member of Congress. You go see a representative, particularly if he's on the Appropriations Committee, and say, can you help get this done? And as an appropriator, I could call any agency in the federal government, but particularly an agency over whose budget I had control, because they were in my subcommittee, and get a question answered. I could call an agency and get something resolved. Indeed, we would hear quietly, sometimes fairly publicly, from Hill Air Force Base, we've got a problem. We don't seem to be able to solve our problem. No problem. Senator, you call the appropriate general, you call the appropriate, and you get your phone call answered very quickly, and then you can talk through the problem and get that solved. Well, when we started going to continuing resolutions to fund the government, what people outside of the Congress didn't realize is that we cut the Congress entirely out of the process. Used to be every subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee would pass a bill every year. Every agency of government had a subcommittee to which it reported, and therefore had to be responsive to the Congress every year. Every year we would have hearings, the secretary would come, then you'd have hearings, the assistant secretary levels, they would come, we'd have questions, we'd have problems. Yes, we'd get them from our home states. Mr. Secretary, why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Gee, who cares about that? I care about that because it's in Utah. Oh, and you are sitting on the subcommittee that controls my budget? I guess maybe I better give you an answer. And that was the lubricant that greased the wheels that would grind so slowly in the normal kind of process. In that sort of process, I could have gotten the head of IT at a cabinet level department and say, why is it that you cannot adapt your IT practices to this? Alerted by the activity that my nephew had described, we could cut through some of this and facilitate a lot of the public-private partnerships. As soon as we stopped doing that, and by coincidence, this is not a cause and effect circumstance, he says, we go through the motions, we'll have a hearing now and then, but the people from the agencies know that the hearing is meaningless because we're not going to pass a bill. And at the end of the budget year, end of the fiscal year, Congress will pass a continuing resolution saying you can continue to spend the way you did before. And he said, we're not doing anything in the committee. And then he said, could you give me a reference to help me find another job? No, he says, this isn't what I signed up for. I signed up to help participate in the government activity, and this is not what I signed up for. Now we're just sitting around. And then he told me a wonderful story. Wonderful in the sense that it is indeed full of wonder, but illustrates what had happened in terms of the ability of the Congress to affect what the executive branch might do through the budget process. Now, all of this is in the public record, so I can tell the story. In the state of Tennessee, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, they have a lot of dams on the river. And the best place to fish, according to Thomas Jefferson, who loved to fish, is immediately downstream from a dam. The fish, for some reason, congregate there. I don't deal with fish a lot, so I don't really know about this, but the best place to fish is right downriver from a dam. The Army Corps of Engineers decided that for whatever reason, they were going to prevent fishing just downstream from the dams in the Tennessee Valley Authority. Okay, Lamar Alexander, the senior senator from Tennessee, happens to be the ranking member of the committee that oversees the budget for the Army Corps of Engineers. Pick up the phone. Get me the commanding general of the Army Corps of Engineers. We're going to have a discussion about this. It took a month for the general to return the senator's call. I've called the commanding general of the Army Corps of Engineers. It took 30 minutes for him to return my call, back in the days when the Congress had that kind of influence. And we got the problem solved within 24 hours. Okay, a month later. What's your problem, Senator? General? Well, Senator, we've decided we're going to stop fishing just downstream. Thanks very much for your opinion, but this is what we're going to do. I'm not Rudy Giuliani. I won't take the call. All right. They do go through the motions of a hearing. The general from the Army Corps of Engineers is now sitting in front of Senator Feinstein, the chairman of the committee, and Senator Alexander, the ranking member. Question time. General. Yes, Senator. It's fishing. TVA. Don't do this. Yes, we'll do it. No, don't do this. Back and forth between Senator Alexander and the general. No, we're not going to change this. Finally, Senator Feinstein interrupts. This is the chairman of the committee now. She interrupts and says, General, as the chairman of this subcommittee, I strongly urge you to pay attention to what the ranking member is telling you. Call down. What's going to happen? They said, we're going to stop fishing downstream. And then they said, you haven't passed a bill for 3 years, and we have no idea when you're going to. And therefore, you can't change anything in your bill telling us we have complete freedom to do whatever we want. Now, I'm sure they didn't put it in quite those blunt terms, but that's basically what they meant. Well, last time I talked to Senator Alexander, shows how resourceful he can be. He said, outside of the budget process, outside of the appropriations process, the Congress has now passed a law forbidding the Army Corps of Engineers to interfere with the fishing downstream of the dams at TVA. But we had to pass a law to do it, and that was a very heavy lift, because this Congress has passed fewer laws than any in memory in modern times. So the process has seized up to the point that if you go to your delegation in your state and say, can you help us, and can the senator get on the phone and speed up these things and streamline the process, through the appropriations process for the last 3 years, the answer's been no. The one glimmer of light is that the Ryan Murray 2-year budget deal kind of broke that logjam. And under the umbrella of that deal, the subcommittees in the appropriations process have now passed a bill. The fellow who asked me to help him find a job called me and said, we've actually written a bill. And the other thing that is happening, now this is just a small cloud on the horizon, no bigger than a man's hand, if you get the biblical allusion. But I'm hoping it will become policy within the House of Representatives. Now, there's a body to conjure with in terms of what they're doing or not doing these days. Within the House of Representatives, a group is now sitting down working out a rule. The House is managed by the Rules Committee, unlike the Senate. The House, the Rules Committee just controls everything that happens. In the Senate, we're a little more freewheeling than that. They're now putting together the outlines of a rule that will allow congressionally directed spending. Now, we will continue to call it congressionally directed spending, lest Rush Limbaugh discovers it and starts calling it earmarking.
You still spend.
But they finally discovered
There are plenty of things to spend federal money
ban
on.
earmarks.
It's a question of who gets to decide. And under the earmarking
For the very
process,
reason
Congress got to decide,
under the
which
Constitution,
is what the Constitution always intended should be
lies
the
in
way
the
to go.
executive branch.
Now, were there abuses?
The
Yes.
legislative branch gets to
Was there
spend the money
criminal
after the
activity and fraud?
the executive branch gets
Yes.
to spend the money after the legislative branch has told them what to spend it on. But if the legislative branch is forbidden from telling them what to spend it on, because that is earmarking it, I'm stunned at how many people think an earmark is an addition. They come in and say, if you just stop that earmarking, we could balance the budget. And I said, do you know what the word earmark means? Go look it up in the dictionary. It means to designate or set aside. So, if there's X amount of money for this program, and I can convince my fellow appropriators to designate this exact real-life example. Last thing I did as a senator, it's the thing I was doing in the last week I was there. X amount of money to build courthouses throughout the United States. And I convinced my fellow senators to designate this much of it to build the courthouse in Salt Lake City. If I had not succeeded in convincing them to designate, earmark, $17 million for that building in Salt Lake City, it would have been spent in Los Angeles. But it would have been spent. We didn't save or lose a dime by the earmark. We just said it. I convinced them, and it was a Democrat who agreed with me. because the Democrats were in control. It was not a partisan kind of thing. I convinced them that spending the money in Salt Lake City made more sense than spending the money in Los Angeles. Why? Because in Salt Lake City, everything was done. This was truly a shovel-ready project, and we were in the depths of the financial slowdown, and contractors were so desperate for money that we could get, 17 million is not what they spent, 17 million is what we saved, because contractors were competing with each other, going lower and lower and lower just to get the work. And I said, if we delay this thing for a couple of years by sending the money to Los Angeles, it'll cost us $17 million more than it would cost if we bought it now. And he said, you're right. And so Congress earmarked that amount of money out of that total money to be spent in Salt Lake City. People say, no, an earmark is an addition. No. It wasn't the money in addition. It was designating or setting aside the money there. All right, back to the point. When Congress listened to the talk show host that said earmarking is terrible, the bridge to nowhere was an earmark by Ted Stevens, and we got to kill it, and aren't we smart? We finally killed the money that was going to be spent on the bridge to nowhere, and it was spent elsewhere in Alaska. It was still spent. There are plenty of things to spend federal money on. It's a question of who gets to decide. And under the earmarking process, Congress got to decide, which is what the Constitution always intended should be the way to go. Now, were there abuses? Yes. Was there criminal activity and fraud? Yes. And Jack Abramoff, who did it, went to jail. And the congressman who sold his office to Jack Abramoff went to jail with him, which is precisely where they belong. And the system worked because they got caught. Washington's the only place I know where when somebody breaks the law, the first impulse upon finding it out is let's change the law. Make it tougher. Well, look, it worked. There was a law against this. They broke it. They got caught. They went to jail. Well, let's change the law to make it tougher. And so we're going to eliminate earmarks so that we'll never have another Jack Abramoff. We'll have another Jack Abramoff, and you'll have another corrupt congressman, because they're human beings. And we have had people scam the federal government all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, who had the federal payroll take care of his political hatchet man in his fights with Alexander Hamilton. And this is nothing new, and we keep saying, oh, how corrupt it is. Frankly, it is far less corrupt now than it has ever been in our history. But that's another topic. Congressionally directed spending is the constitutional way to do it. Earmarking is evil. Fine, I don't care what you call it. If the House does indeed change their rules and go back to the idea that Congress gets to determine how some of this money gets spent, that will open up, once again, the avenue of dealing with your member of Congress when you have a case that's legitimate. Now, let me emphasize that last sentence. I had people come to me asking me to earmark for circumstances that were outrageous. I had people come to me and say, not this blatantly, but this is the message, Senator, I gave X number of dollars to your campaign, and I want this earmark that will help me. And I was very polite as I threw them out of the office and said, I don't do that. The question was not the difference between me and Abramoff because of the earmark procedure. It was between me and Abramoff as to which one of us was honest and which one wasn't. And you cannot, if you have a corrupt congressman, you can't make him uncorrupt by changing the rules. And if you have an honest congressman, you can't corrupt him by saying, here's an opportunity, because the opportunity will always be there in one form or another, and a corrupt member of Congress will always find it. Okay, if indeed, as I say, the House does change the rule to go back to the idea that Congress gets to exercise its constitutional right, and Congress does indeed go back to regular order where they're passing appropriations bills every year, the lubricant to try to open things up a little and get out of the problems that I've described to you will begin to return. And when I talk to some of my colleagues, they say, we can understand why you're just as glad you're not around. And some of them say to me, tell me what it's like on the outside. That looks pretty attractive to me. And a lot of the heavy hitters of my time in Congress are voluntarily leaving, saying it's not any fun anymore and we're not getting anything done anymore. But the green shoots are beginning to come up, and there are members of Congress who are saying we're going to stick it out and make this thing work again. And one hopes that the very pressures of the information revolution that say we can't continue to do business the old slow way, we've got to be more nimble, we've got to have more communication, we've got to have more activity and between the federal government and the contractors, so that we don't have the problem that my nephew describes. I think these will all come together and that things will get better. That the paralysis that we've seen will begin to loosen up, that the ice will begin to melt, and we will start to move in a direction where common sense and good business practices will assert themselves. Now, I've given you the view from the Congress and the OMB and the executive branch kind of thing. I close with these comments about what you can do. People like to make fun of the civil service, like to make fun of federal employees, and they don't do anything, or they don't understand, or all the rest of it. As I say, I'm one of the few members of Congress who's also served in the executive branch, and I got to discover, dealing with civil servants, that just as I can say the vast majority of members of Congress are honest and not corrupt, not corruptible, the vast majority of civil servants are hardworking, intelligent, and desire only to do the right thing for their agency and for the country as a whole. And the culture of each agency is different. But the thing you can do within your own individual agency is change the culture if it is we follow the rules and we don't pay any attention to anything focused on solving problems. If instead the culture in your agency is we want public-private partnerships, and as we deal with potential contractors, we should help them understand how they can make the rules work. Instead of just saying, this is the rule, goodbye, you can say to them, okay, let's work together to see if this can be streamlined somehow. Look, you're knocking at this door, it's the wrong door. Why don't I help you find out what the right door is? You're coming at us with this idea, it's not in the right form, let me help you. And then the public-private partnerships can begin to take place to the benefit of everybody. I give you an example of that as my closing comment. I'm connected to a law firm in Washington as a policy advisor. And one of the partners of the law firm, who had a background in Congress as a staffer, came out to Utah as we took him around to see some potential clients in Utah, and he saw the light rail running up and down the streets in Salt Lake City. And he said, "That really makes me mad." I said, "Why?" You know? And he said, "I was a staffer too," and he named a prominent senator. And he said, "We wanted public transit in our state. And my assignment from my senator was to get appropriations for our state so that we could have public transit. And every time I showed up to make my case, they would listen and say, well, that's all very well, but Senator Bennett has taken all that money to Salt Lake City for their transit program." And I said, "Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to find out that I had that impact on your career." This is why it happened. It wasn't because of Senator Bennett, even though you take the credit. I mean, that's what you do in politics, is you take credit for what everybody else does. And you're the folks who do it, and then it's the others who take credit. But I would sit there in meetings at the banking committee that oversees transit money and listen to senators from other states saying, "We should have a transit program like they have in Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City was the example. Salt Lake City is..." And how did all this come to pass? Yes, I was able to open some doors and make some introductions. But the reason it came to pass is because the people at UTA did their homework and made the presentation. They were superb. This is what we want to do. Okay, get you all in a room, and pretty soon the line between UTA and FDA began to blur, get a little fuzzy, as the feds were helping the folks in Utah make wise decisions as to what would make a wise program, and the folks in Utah were helping the feds understand what had to be done in the real world of running a transit system rather than in the theoretical world of just drawing lines on paper. And the Utah track system remains the #1 example of mass transit done well anywhere in the country. So if you want a model as to how to build the right kind of public-private partnership, just look down the street. Indeed, you don't even need to look down the street. Watch Front Runner go by, and you say, these are the people who know how to do it. Let's ask them. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being with you, and accept my thanks as a citizen for all of the work those of you in the civil service do. As I say, I came to appreciate you and understand how essential you are to the running of the government. And even in these days when we've had a dysfunctional Congress, and I won't discuss the president, the fact that we have the government continuing to run functionally pretty well is all up to you. And you deserve all the thanks you can get for having done and continuing to do the jobs the way you do, and I'm happy to extend it. Thank you.
Mr. Bennett, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for your contribution this morning. We have a small token of our appreciation, a gift basket with many things Utah in them.
All right, and now that I'm no longer in the Senate, I don't have to ask if it costs more than $50.